we'll get started. Oh, yes. Policy Talk is a bi-monthly discussion forum that brings perspectives and analytical frameworks to bear on some of the outstanding public policy issues of our times. The purpose is to expand the universe of possible alternatives and extend one's range of curiosity by bringing different viewpoints to the public policy discussion. Public policy researchers want to understand why policy decisions and their outcomes change, stay stable, vary from sector to sector, and differ in their consequences for the public. It's a distinctive and problematic area of study and tends to include in its baseline all political activity and institutions, from voting, political cultures, parties, legislatures, bureaucracies, international agencies, local governments, and back again to the citizens at the receiving end. Policy Talk will take up the challenges of democracy and discuss why some issues are taken for action and some are ignored, emphasizing, as truisms do, that public policy relates to the political construction of problems that are picked up for public action. Attempts have been made by researchers to explore what shapes policy narratives while being constrained by them at the same time. This is broadly the rationale for us in the Center for Public Policy and Governance, Institute of Social Sciences, New Delhi, to initiate the Policy Talk series today. Now it's with great pleasure that I would like to begin my Policy Talk series with Professor Alasdair Roberts, who has been selected for the 2022 Fred Riggs Award for Lifetime Achievement in International and Comparative Public Administration from the American Society for Public Administration. Professor Roberts teaches at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, USA, where he is currently Director, School of Public Policy. Professor Roberts, through his books and articles over a period of time in the field of public policy and administration, has substantively contributed to seminal debates and discourses in the academic discipline of public policy and administration. He is a prolific writer and recipient of several awards for his publications over a period of time. His latest book, titled Strategies for Governing Reinventing Public Administration for a Dangerous Century, was published by Cornell University Press in 2019. The book is a plea to reinvigorate public administration and public management to prepare for the challenges of governance in the 21st century. His forthcoming book, Superstates, Empires of the 21st Century, is to be published by Polity Books in 2022. So, Professor Roberts, if I may start with a couple of questions for you in this conversation that we are going to have. The first question, may I ask you, Dr. Roberts, I hope you can take them up there'll be a series of questions. I hope you can take them all up in our conversation today. My first question to you would be, could you tell us a little about the School of Public Policy, University of Massachusetts? How would you introduce your school to us?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today and to visit virtually with my friends in India. I've been in India many times over the last 20 years and hope to be there again soon. At the moment, I'm a director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. University of Massachusetts is the major public university in the state of Massachusetts in the US. And this is the main campus here in Amherst, Massachusetts. And the School of Public Policy was established in 2015. We have a faculty of about 20 individuals coming from many different disciplines. It's one of the key features of our program is that it's highly interdisciplinary. And we have graduate programs. We have a total enrollment of about 120 graduate students, and we're starting a new undergraduate program in the spring.
Okay, thank you. My second question to you, Dr. Roberts. Yehezkel Dror, the founder of the discipline of policy sciences, once remarked, policy sciences is concerned with the contributions of systematic knowledge, structured rationality, and organized creativity to better policy making. Do you believe that policy science has truly evolved to become a science today, especially with the emergence of the knowledge economy and the use of data science in public policy making? Yes, Dr. Roberts, I'd like to hear you on this.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. I think I would put it this way. I don't actually regard public policy as a science itself. I would think of it more as a craft or a form of statecraft. It's the task of deciding how to respond to challenging policy problems, usually under conditions of great uncertainty, and usually in situations where it's necessary to make very difficult trade-offs between contending values. And because we have those elements of value trade-offs and decision-making under uncertainty, which involve considerations about how we all feel about risk and about the present and the future, it's difficult to say that this is a science. It's a form of judgment. Having said that, there are ways in which scientific knowledge can inform the crafting of public policy, and clearly we've become more sophisticated in terms of applying scientific techniques to know more about the world that we are trying to improve. So I think I would say that public policy is a radical project that's concerned with exercising judgment about how to respond to important problems that draws on knowledge acquired through the scientific method, but is not determined by it.
Thank you. My next question to you, Dr. Roberts. The first decades of this century have been challenging, and there'll be more turbulence in the coming decades. As the great battle between democracy and authoritarianism continues, debate about the role of government will persist. So will challenges to core institutions. How do we build up our response to these challenges?
That's these are very challenging questions, but they're good questions. They're important questions. I think, you know, one of the points that I made in this last book I did for Cornell University Press called Strategies for Governing is precisely that this will be a dangerous century because we will be confronted, societies will be confronted with so many immense challenges. Climate change is obviously at the very top of the list. Urbanization, especially in the global south, is going to be an immense challenge. Improving, advancing economic development, making sure that people have meaningful and well-compensated jobs is going to be an immense challenge. We can see that just from the news and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we can't take peace for granted either. So there are going to be these really immense challenges, which, if not grappled with effectively, could produce disastrous outcomes for human welfare. And so I think our challenge in the field of public policy or public administration is very important. And it's a question of how we build state capacity, governmental capacity, and how we improve civil society capacity so that societies are resilient, capable of addressing these major shocks. And one old formula for resilience was, well, you basically establish regimes that are authoritarian in character, that they're highly centralized. Authority is centralized, and the theory is that this is essential to allow the quick mobilization of resources in response to major threats. But none of us want to live in a society that surrenders human rights in the name of resilience. So I think the challenge for us in our field going forward will be, how do we create societies, systems that are resilient, that are capable of handling these multiple shocks, but also capable of doing that in a way that we still respect democracy and human rights.
Dr. Roberts, you've often said that the real battle for liberal democracy will be waged in Asia. And within Asia, the struggle between the two giants, India and China. Together, they cover 1/3 of mankind. China is the world's second largest economy. India may become the third. Which of these two political systems will become the model, according to you, for other developing states, and why should it become a model?
Uh, it's a good question. Again, and I'm trying to think about how to answer it. We've had, in a way, a test of the two models recently when we look at the way in which the two systems have responded to the pandemic. And it seemed that the Chinese system had certain short-term advantages. The number of deaths in China obviously was much lower, precisely because it was a certain kind of authoritarian regime that was capable of responding decisively without worrying much about infringement of personal liberties as it responded to the pandemic. But I think the Chinese system also has significant vulnerabilities. There are potential dangers in the Chinese system. It relies very heavily on a massive centrally run bureaucracy. It's vulnerable to leadership failure at the top. It's vulnerable to problems of bureaucratic misconduct. Obviously, it tramples on human rights in many ways. So we don't want to go down that path. I think what we want to do is find a system, a certain kind of regime that is resilient, capable of responding to challenges, respectful of human rights. India clearly is attempting to develop an alternative model that is respectful of democracy and human rights. I do worry. Obviously, there's a concern about the development of state capacity in India. That is a significant concern. Another issue too is about the way in which we think about the role of central government and state governments and local governments. And in the Indian context, one of the things I do worry about is a tendency toward over-centralization. That is to say, an assumption that the center must respond to all major shocks, and a tendency of democratic politics to put pressure on the center to be the lead in responding to shocks. I wonder whether systems are capable of, I worry about the competence of systems that concentrate responsibility so much at the top. It puts tremendous pressure on decision makers at the top, and it also tests bureaucratic capacity, because the notion that you can make policy in Delhi and have it applied consistently and competently throughout such a vast country is really a pretty strong assumption. So for me, when I look at the the Indian case, I'm thinking not just about the question of is it democratic or non-democratic. I'm also thinking about state capacity and the allocation of state responsibilities between the center, state governments, and local governments.
Uh, Professor Roberts, in a 75-year-old democracy like India, there have been recurring crises of stability due to the several divides we have: caste, class, region, race, community. There have been a million mutinies. If we have survived, it is because of democracy that allows flexibility and amendability, leading to a sense of progressive change. Several times in our journey as a democracy, in cases of intrastate conflict, the political regimes have resorted to concentrating executive power, limiting protest and dissent. But even with these temporary setbacks, Indian democracy, I personally feel, has bounced back stronger. Today, despite pessimism, nobody seriously believes that Indian democracy is replaceable by any other system. How would you look at contemporary governance challenges in India, Professor Roberts?
I actually, in this book that I have coming out at the end of the year called Super States, I sort of think about this question, and I make the observation that, going forward, about 40% of the world's population is going to live in just four places: India, China, the European Union, and the United States. And these are both, I call them super states because they have a lot of land, they're big in territory, they're big in population. The smallest superstate, the US, will have about 350 million. Obviously, India will have about 1.7 billion people by 2050, which incidentally is just an extraordinary number. That's more than the total world population a century ago. And these four places, these four polities, all grapple with the similar challenge of, as you say, they all have to deal with the challenge of diversity and complexity. You can't forge these entities into, well, you could try, but it would be very difficult to forge these entities into conventional nation states because you're always going to have linguistic and cultural diversity and diversity in economic circumstances. And so the question in these big polities is basically, how do you manage diversity? How do you allow all of the pieces to sort of cohabit together? One And when you look at these four different regimes, you see four different answers to that question. You have on the one hand the Chinese approach, which is authoritarian. It's about centralization and authoritarian party rule. Then you have on the other hand, at the other extreme, the European Union, which is about radical decentralization. And you've got a sort of diplomatic coordinating capacity at the center for that system. And we might think of those as sort of the two alternate sides of two very different models for how you handle diversity. And the question, I suppose, is where is India in that spectrum? The one concern I have is that you can see in India, there's always been this concern about so-called centrifugal tendencies, centrifugal pressures. And one does see in moments of stress a tendency for authority to be centralized. You saw it under Nehru in the 1950s. You saw it under Indira Gandhi in the mid-1970s. And you may see a similar tendency today under Narendra Modi. The center reasserting itself and so on. And I worry about that formula. The design. I worry about that sort of way of handling centrifugal pressures for two reasons. The first, because it usually involves some kind of limitation of autonomy and rights, and the second, because I'm just not sure it even works on the basic test of preserving stability and cohesion. because, as I said a moment ago, it puts so much pressure on central institutions. I don't think that I'm not sure that centralization and authoritarian rule, not that India is headed to authoritarian rule, works in a country that has 1.7 billion people. You have to find some way to decentralize authority and allow states and localities more room to serve their people.
Um, a bane of Indian democracy has always been its underperformance. The current regime has to be hard on implementation to be able to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. A Herculean effort is required to be self-reliant and catch up with China to become the world's third largest economy. Professor Roberts, is this obsession with China truly necessary?
Uh, I suppose, let
We
me say,
are we are obsessed with China. That's
yes,
why
yeah,
I
yes,
asked you
yeah.
this question.
I suppose, you could say yes, in a limited way, because, 30 years ago, um, per capita income in India and China were more or less the same. And in fact, I think per capita income in India in the early 1990s was a little higher than it was in China. And now the tables have turned quite dramatically. And I believe per capita income in China today is, I want to say, something like 8 to 10 times higher than it is in India. And in terms of human welfare, that's important, right? That means that hundreds of millions of people in China have been lifted out of poverty. So I think it's worthwhile to look at China, because in the limited sense that uh, that's the sort of outcome we want for people. We want to improve human welfare. We want to raise people out of poverty. And if looking at China uh, pushes decision makers in India to think seriously about how to improve human welfare, so much the better. Now, having said that, what we don't want to do is reprise the Chinese technique for doing that, which, as I've said, is essentially centralized authoritarian rule. So the question is, how do we develop, let's say, Indian methods for achieving Chinese results? And so I think that would be the way I would sort of frame my response to the question.
Um, my next question, capitalism always demands rationality and discipline. Yet the corona period saw the fragility of state systems based on these, the collapse of Trumpism, and the need for strong welfare states once again. What are the other significant takeaways for public policy in the post-COVID era, according to you, Professor Roberts?
Well, if we were having a conversation 20 years ago, if it were the year 2000, the conventional wisdom in the year 2000 was that we were heading into the era of globalization. Many people were saying that the state was withering away. Many people were writing about the end of the nation state and so on. Governments don't matter in the age of globalization. People were feeling very confident about the system of deregulated capitalism, especially deregulated finance. All the expert economists said, the wonderful thing is that finance has become much more sophisticated in governing its own affairs, that markets were essentially self-regulating, and that this was all to the good. And it turned out, not for the first time, that many people who were touting the advantages of globalization and economic deregulation had overstated the case, that in fact the system of deregulated global capitalism was unstable. We could have learned this from history, prone to crashes, and indeed we had a major crash in 2007 and 2008. And, I think that is one of several shocks over the last 20 years that has just reminded us about the importance of government, about the critical role of the state. Certainly in the West, the terror attacks of 2001, basically the surge of terrorism between 2001 and 2005, provided another reminder about the importance of the state. The pandemic has provided yet another reminder about the importance of the state and state capacity. And you've also seen in many countries this sort of populist pushback, which is to some degree a complaint about the failure of governments to take care of their own people. And so for all of these reasons, I think we've seen a renewed recognition that the state matters. And for those of us in public policy, public administration, that means we have to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we make the state work competently? How do we develop, improve its capacity to deliver services and to regulate without running into all of the historic pitfalls of bureaucratism and corruption and so on?
Thank you. To my mind, Professor Robertson, correct me if I'm wrong, today the big questions are all related to ethics. How the transition from a soft state to a hard state, how does it impact on democracy? Is a question that's often debated. Whether prosperity lessens entrenched inequalities, or let's say the question of integration of multiracial democracies. Therefore, what is a substantivist democracy needs to be redefined to my mind. What are the big questions of public policy and governance? Therefore, need to be questioned again and again. And how would you, as a professor of public policy and governance, prioritize them today? What are these big questions to your mind? And are they related to ethics, really?
So I think, and this is sort of going back to the point that we made at the start, the challenge for us is to sort out how to develop ways of governing that are effective, and this goes to your point about a hard state that can actually deliver services and regulate competently. How do we develop systems that can govern effectively, but also respect democracy and human rights? So that's a hard constraint for us. We want systems that respect human rights. And so that's a moral project, as you say. It's sort of an inherently ethical exercise. I think the one thing I would say, sometimes we talk about democracy as though it's sort of a light switch. We ask, is country X a democracy or not? And I think the point I would make is that our understanding of what is necessary to count a system as democratic changes over time. We're constantly always trying to sort out what democracy implies. And I think for example, in the Indian context, it's going to be a question of what kind of democracy do we want at different levels of government? How do we make systems democratic at the state level, at the local level? How much democracy do we think we need at the center? Where should responsibilities be allocated between these levels? And my inclination is to think that in the very long run, what we want is more robust capacity at the state and local level, strong forms of democratic accountability at the state and local level, a reduced scope of responsibilities at the center, and a recognition that at the center, what we may be concerned with is the development of mechanisms to allow different parts of the country different sections of the country to negotiate, sort of how to live together. I think what I'm suggesting is on that spectrum between China and the European Union I described, it might mean that moving a little more toward the EU model than the China model. In a country that's going to include 1.7 billion people, that would be I think, a more sensible way to think about the governance of the country. Unfortunately, I can't get your audio. I think you're on mute.
Yes. Looking at the global events today, Professor Roberts, do you foresee tectonic shifts in the alliances and the existing power structures within the current global order? How do you look at the emerging global order that you see, emerge? If you say that there's a new order that's emerging, do you agree, or do you believe that these are, there are always unforeseen events that do happen, and they do not necessarily mean any kind of tectonic shifts?
Yes. Well, very, there's a famous American saying, very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think, we can see clearly, as you said earlier on, the Indian economy will continue to grow and will be the third largest economy in the world by 2050. China obviously will continue to be a major economic player. I noted in passing in my book that 40 years ago, Canada and China had economies of roughly the same size, just to give you a dramatic sense of the way in which the world has changed. The EU and the United States will still be major economic players, but they won't be dominant players in the ways they are today. So I think there will be shifts in international relations because of these underlying economic shifts. I don't think that Russia obviously is a problematic actor, but I don't think it's going to be a world power in 2050 in the way in which the Soviet Union was in 1970. So I think there will be important shifts. And, I think it's good that there are going to be important shifts. And I will say, and this is going down from the sort of grand sphere of international relations to our area of academia, I think it would be wonderful if there was a shift in the sort of balance of forces in academia, in public policy and public administration. One of my ongoing laments has been that the literature in this field, the scholarly literature in this field, and the thinking in this field, the who sets the agenda, who sets the intellectual frameworks for the field, has come predominantly from a very small handful of countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands, a very small group of well-established countries in the global north. And the difficulty with that literature and that body of ideas is that it's completely oriented toward the realities and the preoccupations of those very small countries. And so it does not pay adequate attention to some really big problems that people in countries like India worry about. Most countries in the world are fragile states. The countries in the global north that set the research agenda, by and large, are not fragile states. But if we were developing an intellectual agenda that really addressed the problems confronting most people on this planet, fragility would be at the top of the list. Public order, state capacity, corruption, delivery of basic services like education and healthcare. It would be a quite different agenda. And I think we can hope that shift will happen in our field over the next 15 or 20 years, that that we will spend more time focusing on the core problems that are important for countries like India. And if I could just sort of go on for a bit longer, I mean, one of the very exciting things is in India, the amount of writing and scholarship that's going on in public policy just over the last 15 or 20 years, the change in the landscape is really quite remarkable. Every week there's a very interesting new book coming out talking about governance and public policy in India. There are so many young scholars who are doing very sophisticated and interesting work that this really is a very exciting time to be in this field in India.
Well, my last question to you, uh, Professor Roberts, before we end this conversation, uh, you know, you do talk of changing perspectives, but there is a commonality among scholars in public policy and governance all over the world, that there is something happening which you've just talked about, uh, the emerging South, and that's been happening for quite some time. Now, if you look at the 21st century and the discipline of public policy and governance, where would you place South Asia and South Asian scholars in their contribution to public administration theory? And I would say, how would you look at the Indian uh, model of democracy? Because India is the world's largest democracy. And how do our governance practices, policy and governance practices, our best practices, uh, do you think that India matters? Today, how do you think India matters globally? As a spokesperson of the global South, as a country from South Asia, where would you place India, and how would you say that India matters in the 21st century?
Well, so why India matters, I think the important point we want to make is that it is addressing and will continue to address fundamental problems of governance. You know, as we were saying a moment ago, the general question of how you improve the welfare of people by assuring their security, protecting them against discrimination, providing basic services like education and healthcare, getting people meaningful jobs. Um, these are all profoundly important questions, not just in India, but in many other countries in the global South. For most people in the world, we might say. The challenges that India will face in the coming decades, for example, how do you deal with the growing effects of climate change, are going to be critically important. That will affect most people in the global South profoundly. Questions like urbanization, you know, the growth of cities in the global South is going to be remarkable over the next 20 or 30 years. And if this is not handled well, the results could be very dire. But you know, India will be on the forefront of that that question as well. So India matters in the sense that it will be addressing a range of questions that are of fundamental importance for billions of people around the world. So that's I think the first thing we could say. The second thing we could say is that the Indian commitment has been to find ways of addressing these fundamental questions while also respecting democracy and human rights. People who want to address the question of how to fix these problems while respecting democracy and human rights can't look to China. China does not provide an answer on that question. So India has the opportunity to show leadership on that particular question as well. And I think I had another thought, but my aging brain has forgotten what it might be. But I think this is why India has the opportunity to sort of take the leadership. I think what I was going to say is that, you know, one of the One of the things that is important is that there tends to be, they sometimes talk about how research goes on in silos, by which they mean, researchers in different areas examine roughly the same problem, but they do it in separate communities using separate language. And one of the difficulties is that very often in countries like India, there are scholars who are investigating really interesting questions of public policy and public administration, but they might be doing it under the language of development studies, which is a different kind of scholarly silo. When you look at the major journals in public administration and you look for the number of articles coming from India, the number of articles is very small. And sometimes that's not because there's an absence of research. It's because the research that's going on is going on in a different silo with different vocabulary. So one important area where we can make some quick gains in terms of sharing knowledge is just by looking for ways to break down those silos, to make connections between scholars in different fields who are addressing essentially the same questions. The other thing I think, and this is an idea that I've got formulating in my head, and I want to be careful about how I frame it, is I think there's a case for a bit of sort of scholarly nationalism. And I say this as a Canadian who has grappled for many years with making a way in a field that is dominated by American scholarship. One of the difficulties is that to engage in this intellectual community, you sometimes have to make sacrifices. You have to address American questions rather than, let's say, in my case, Canadian questions. One of the difficulties in the Indian case is that the price of admission to the scholarly community sometimes has seemed like surrendering Indian concerns and talking about the concerns of countries in the global north. And I think it is time to push back a little more strongly on that and ask organizations or journals or academic associations that purport to be international or global organizations, where is the space for the representation of voices from the global south, and in particular from South Asia? If we're going to call this a truly international or global conversation, where is there room at the table to discuss all of these profoundly important questions that we've canvassed?
Thank you, Professor Roberts. This has been a wonderful conversation. I chose you to be the first person I wanted to talk to in my Policy Talk series, because you deal with the big questions in all your books and publications that I've seen. And I wanted this kind of a, let's say, almost a North-South dialogue on major issues of public policy and governance, and a scholar from the North talking to a scholar from the South. I do believe that we should engage in conversations on the big issues instead of the micro issues. We should talk about the macro issues of public policy and governance. And I truly believe that the conversation needed to start with you, because you've written almost always about this, about the need for a North-South dialogue. And it's been wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for your very thoughtful comments and seminal observations on a lot of issues, and maybe some of the tricky questions that I gave you. You talked very disarmingly, and this was your honest opinion, which you gave us today. And really, I do look forward to more conversations with you. And of course, I hope we see you in India soon. Thank you for giving us the time for this conversation on a range of issues on public policy and governance. And we look forward to more conversations. Thank you, Professor Roberts. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I hope to see you in India soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.